This is the nature of things. Laser weapons are often the weapons of choice in sci-fi space wars, but the U.S. Air Force has years of experience with them too.
This is ETSO 1. ETSO stands for Electric Discharge Coaxial Laser. ETSO 1, laser on in 5.
The Air Force told Congress that it had no intentions of using Starfire for anything related to anti-satellite weapons. However, they are doing a test to make the laser beam very skinny and make it stay very stable as it goes up, and they're going to target that on a satellite. One of the things that I think people need to know is that most technology that's used in space can be used either for weapons purposes or it can be used for totally benign, good purposes. Small microsatellites that can go around a big satellite, take pictures. Good idea. That same little microsatellite that's going around the big satellite could be sent up to go around another person's satellite and run into it and kill it.
Just over 50 years ago, the first satellite was spun into orbit. Space filled us with optimism and awe. But were we, in fact, just staking out a new war zone? We think space is a pristine, majestic, and untouched place. But is it? It now seems that even space is getting cluttered. There are all kinds of satellites and even space junk orbiting the Earth. So how much of it is connected to military ambitions in space? From a city street, the end of the Earth's atmosphere and the beginning of space is 100 kilometers away. It's called the Kármán line. Space is closer than it seems.
If you look at space, lots of times you think about the Hubble telescope or, Mars probes, but most people don't realize that they use space every day. When you open your cell phone to make a call, when you take money out of the bank with your ATM card, satellite bring you your TV shows and live news from around the world. You use them each time you rely on a positioning system for air, for sea, for land traffic control, and even in your own car. There would be no weather forecasting, disaster monitoring without satellites. Our entire life depends on satellites. They're essential, but we're not conscious of that until we lose it.
There's more and more traffic in space. Today, 1,000 active satellites are officially recorded as circling the Earth. Most countries use satellite technology, and 45 nations own their own orbiting satellites. But the United States is the master of space. It dominates as the owner and user of space systems, both civilian and military.
Space is the backbone of our national security. There is no substitute, and there is no alternative to military dominance in space. And this conviction should drive our course for the next 50 years.
The U.S. Air Force Academy trains the officers who will be the military space elite of tomorrow.
Caesar Augustus came to power 27 years before Christ was born. People in the Roman Empire lived better under Caesar Augustus than they had in any empire on earth during any previous time. Roads improved, pirates no longer threatened ships on the high seas. Life was so good during this time that the period acquired a name. It was and is still referred to as the Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. Another period of peace has acquired a name. It is called the Pax Americana, or the American peace.
The cadets understand that they have a mission.
My name is Cadet First Class Colton Tuttle. I'm a cadet at the Air Force Academy. I graduate in 44 days, and I'm just hoping to do my part to make sure that everyone here can enjoy their freedoms.
Pax Americana is a political view which simply says that because America is currently the sole superpower, that it has not only the ability but the responsibility into the far future to maintain world peace.
Eyes! Right!
America now has the chance to establish an American empire, a Pax Americana, that will last for many, many decades. And one of the ways to do this is to establish strong American control of space.
China carried out its first anti-satellite weapons test on an old weather satellite about 500 miles up.
According to U.S. government officials, after 3 misses, China succeeded in shooting down one of its own aging weather satellites.
The test may be part of China's efforts to establish a military presence in space. Does this mean the spy satellites the United States depends on could be shot down?
The American media made a big story out of China's 2007 anti-satellite test.
It could cripple us. Is that what they're up to?
Was it a sign of a growing rivalry in space weapons? Space has become the backbone of American military power. It may also be its Achilles heel.
The United States, and particularly its intelligence services, worry about an attack on the United States that is not nuclear weapons, that is not chemicals, that is not biological, but is technological.
A surprise attack in space. This is the ultimate nightmare. By knocking out 50 U.S. military satellites, the Chinese could literally cripple the U.S. military. They could prevent the military from being able to communicate with its forces. They could blind the U.S. intelligence community, which uses electro-optic satellites to determine military force movements around the world. And they could also cripple the guidance systems that are used on precision-guided munitions that are satellite-guided. In many sense, it could be a kind of an electronic Pearl Harbor. Without space, the U.S. would be unable to conduct any type of military operation in an effective way.
There's a tremendous premium on the United States being able to prevent other people from attacking our assets in space and to ensure that we can continue to exercise full use of them and, if necessary, also to be able to deny others use of similar assets for their own purposes.
The U.S. Air Force will lead the charge.
The world has changed. As more and more countries develop a presence in outer space, the possibility of a space battle is no longer science fiction. Our new world requires new solutions. Meet U.S. Air Force Space Command. This elite force is America's eye in the sky, keeping watch over our interests high above the ground.
In Colorado Springs, the Aeronautics Laboratory spreads over 5,000 square meters.
I'm the permanent professor and head of the Department of Astronautics here at the Air Force Academy. And we've been continually teaching the fundamentals of astronautics to our cadets. And every cadet that has graduated from the Air Force Academy, almost 40,000 now, have taken at least one course in our department.
This area right here, what's that called? Bow shock, right. And superimposed on this, of course, we have a HEO, highly elliptic orbit.
In military strategy, it shows that if you want to control the battlefield, you need to be the first in seizing the high ground, the most advanced frontier. Whether it be land, sea, air, and now space, the person that controls that has the advantage. So making sure that we can deny our enemies space is a huge advantage.
September 6, 1944. Armed with over a ton of high explosive, Germany's first tactical rocket, now called the V-2, the vengeance weapon, is fired at London.
Hitler's army was the first to reach the high ground of space with the pioneering V-2 rocket. The V-2 was the first human-engineered object to travel through space, en route to its targets in Europe.
Cette fusée a été développée dans le cadre du Troisième Reich. Elle a été utilisée par les armées nazies. À la fin de la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, c'était les SS qui étaient en charge d'assurer la réalisation du programme.
The chief engineer behind the V-2's design and manufacture was a young SS officer, Werner von Braun. This space weapons pioneer had created the very first ballistic missile. That sparked interest across the Atlantic.
La V2, c'est vraiment considéré à la fin de la guerre comme quelque chose qu'il fallait absolument prendre aussi bien par les soviétiques que par les occidentaux. Et donc, von Braun a été récupéré avec une centaine de ses meilleurs ingénieurs dans le cadre d'une opération qui s'appelait Opération Paperclip, c'était le nom de code. Il a été transporté aux États-Unis.
The Pentagon assigned von Braun and his team of German scientists the task of designing an improved version of the V-2. Spearheading the Redstone, the first U.S. ballistic missile, propelled von Braun to the highest sphere of military and scientific influence.
Werner von Braun ultimately became associate director of NASA, and his former Nazi scientists functioned as collaborators with the U.S. military in looking towards space as a new arena of war.
Gentlemen, will you please take your seats so we can begin today's conference? I take a great deal of pleasure in presenting to you today as our guest speaker, Dr. Werner von Braun.
Gentlemen, the conquest of outer space is the greatest technological challenge of the age in which we live. On the right side of this picture, you see a large wheel-shaped space station. This, of course, offers tremendous possibilities to reconnaissance, and both in the civilian sense as in the military sense.
These Nazi scientists, these Nazi space scientists that came to this country under Project Paperclip, developed schemes to essentially control the Earth from space with space-based weapons.
It seems even feasible to use such a platform in space as a base for the bombing of objects on the ground. And it is my opinion that such bombing could be carried out with an unprecedented accuracy from such a station.
La plupart des ingénieurs allemands qui ont été ainsi, qui sont partis ainsi aux États-Unis, ont été pendant quelques années considérés avec une certaine suspicion, mais ensuite ils sont devenus citoyens américains et ils ont joué un rôle dans le développement de l'espace aux États-Unis, moins des missiles, et von Braun, donc, plus tard, est devenu le grand responsable de la construction des fusées géantes Saturne.
Then, October 4th, 1957, Russia shocks the free world. The USSR hurls into orbit the world's first Earth satellite, Sputnik 1. The Soviets are now the unquestionable leaders in the race for space.
We've been assigned the mission of launching a scientific Earth satellite. I promised the Secretary of the Army that we would be ready in 90 days or less. Let's go, Werner.
Werner von Braun met the U.S. military's 90-day deadline. His modified V-2 launched the first American satellite into orbit.
One, fire command.
flashed of the long-awaited event. America has her satellite in orbit.
The space race was on, including a race for space weapons. Space weapons feature prominently in science fiction, but how close are we to seeing real weapon systems in space? Fiction did aspire to become fact when President Ronald Reagan,
my fellow Americans,
announced his Star Wars plan.
Effort which holds the promise of changing the course of human history. I ask for your prayers and your support. Thank you. Good night.
When I joined the staff of the Committee on Armed Services in the U.S. House of Representatives back in 1985, my first assignment was to investigate and oversee the Strategic Defense Initiative. This was President Ronald Reagan's Star Wars program.
This new national strategy represents a break from the dangerous policy of mutual assured destruction.
In Reagan's version of Star Wars, the newly designed space shuttle would deploy his version of the Force.
Our reconnaissance systems verify a Soviet launch. U.S. interceptors are fired as Level 1 defense goes into action.
Batteries of weapons would be positioned in orbit to target enemy nuclear missiles before they reached U.S. territory.
At the time, the prevailing view was that this was going to work, that the technology was almost in hand, and that this was going to change everything. I remember the briefing I got from my staff director who said not just anti-missile systems, but all major weapon systems were going to move to space, that space was the new high ground. Even then we talked about it in that way, where all major military operations were going to be by the end of that century.
It was a debate of stellar proportions.
Many scientists, including me, believed the plan was nonsense.
It cannot protect the population of the United States. It can be, by the Soviets, overwhelmed, outfoxed, underflown.
I, for one, am not willing and able to just accept the idea that it can't work.
Reagan's plans to deploy weapons in space were too ambitious, and most of them never left the drawing board. But the U.S. military remained convinced the plans could succeed. At the turn of the 21st century, Star Wars would resurface, but under a different name. Under President George W. Bush, it was called missile defense.
We need a new framework that allows us to build missile defenses to counter the different threats of today's world.
I hope we'll also move forward on ballistic missile defense cooperation.
We must develop and we must deploy effective missile defenses.
Back in 2000, when President Bush took office, he and his cadre of people that surrounded him, you think of Paul Wolfowitz, you think of Donald Rumsfeld, you think of Dick Cheney, all of them really only had two priorities. One was to get rid of Saddam Hussein. The second was to build a missile defense system.
Good morning. I've just concluded a meeting of my National Security Council. We reviewed what I've discussed with my friend, President Vladimir Putin, over the course of many meetings and many months, and that is the need for America to move beyond the 1972 anti-ballistic missile treaty.
When George W. Bush became president, immediately he gave 6-month notice to Russia that we're pulling out, the United States is pulling out of the ABM treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, that limited the United States' ability to test and deploy anti-satellite weapons, so-called missile defense systems, and other space technology.
At the Pentagon today, a warning that space will become the next big battleground. To meet the challenge, Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld is making space a top Pentagon priority, putting a 4-star general at the head of a new Air Force Space Command to take charge of all military space activity, including any new anti-missile defense.
Pay careful attention to promoting our interest in space.
Pentagon officials say it's the first step toward eventually putting weapons into space.
But what exactly is a space weapon? Is it always space-based? Trying to track down what the Defense Department is spending on space weapons projects is a tricky business. At the Starfire Optical Range, the Air Force Research Laboratory is testing advanced land-based lasers.
Starfire has been used primarily in the past to do research on satellite tracking. Also, they've done a lot of work in astronomy with range finding of stars. So you use the laser to be able to help tell you where the star is and how far away it is. In the budget documents from the Air Force, there has also been mention of the use of Starfire for anti-satellite weapons activities. The Air Force told Congress that it had no intentions of using Starfire for anything related to anti-satellite weapons. However, they are doing a test to make the laser beam very skinny and make it stay very stable as it goes up, and they're going to target that on a satellite. If you're tracking a satellite, you don't need a very skinny laser beam. In fact, you want kind of a wide one because you want to make sure you catch it in the view, right? So many of us here are concerned that this kind of a test is actually an anti-satellite weapons test in disguise.
In April of 2005, the Air Force launched an experimental satellite. Its name was the XSS-11. Theoretically, this experimental microsatellite has the ability to disrupt other nations' satellites. Has it done so? No. Could it do so? En principe, okay? But in reality, we don't know.
One of the things that I think people need to know is that most technology that's used in space can be used either for weapons purposes or it can be used for totally benign, good purposes. Lasers for tracking, good idea, more precise tracking. Small microsatellites that can go around a big satellite and take pictures, good idea, because it helps you figure out what went wrong with your satellite, and that's hard to do right now. Good idea. That same little microsatellite that's going around the big satellite could be sent up to go around another person's satellite and run into it and kill it. The technology doesn't know whether it's a weapon or whether it's a benign use. The question is going to come down to the intent of the people who are building these systems.
In simulated missile defense combat situations like this one, rogue nations launch nuclear missiles at major American cities.
I have a valid missile event. I agree, that's a valid event. You have 2 per track. 0,
but in
0,
reality,
0, 1,
who would launch such intercontinental missile attacks against the U.S.?
Possible impact in San Francisco, sir.
Cue the X-band platform for long-range tracks over the pole.
X-band platform is queued.
The interesting thing is that the threat is actually shrinking, not increasing. The ballistic missile threat is declining. There are far fewer ballistic missiles in the world now than there were 15 years ago. There are fewer countries with ballistic missile programs. There are fewer hostile countries to the United States with ballistic missile programs. When you look at it, it really comes down to a handful of states whose programs we worry about, North Korea and Iran, basically, and they only have medium-range missiles. That is, they can't reach the United States.
4 administrations have succeeded Ronald Reagan's. All of them, Republican and Democrat, have endorsed missile defense under a variety of names for a total cost of $200 billion. Although President Obama did scrap plans for an anti-ballistic missile shield in Eastern Europe.
It's a con. It's a con. Missile defense is the greatest fraud in the Department of Defense, and believe me, it's had a lot of competitors. I really believe this. Missile defense is the longest running fraud in the history of the U.S. Department of Defense.
But what if missile defense was another way of funding space weaponry? In March 2008, the U.S. used its missile defense system to destroy one of its own disabled satellites. Missile interceptors, launched from Earth and also called kill vehicles, now offer the capability of obliterating any satellite in low Earth orbit.
Missile defense is a Trojan horse. It has nothing to do with defense whatsoever. It's all about projecting power. It's about offense. I've been to the bases in Colorado Springs, and I've personally seen over the door where it says Master of Space. And I've read the documents, Vision for 2020, and a whole array of other military Space Command documents that have said for years that the U.S. will control space, that we will dominate space, that we will deny other countries access to space. We, 5% of the world's population in the United States, are going to deny other countries access to space. I mean, absolutely provocative.
I would tell you that we are so dominant in space that I pity a country that would come up against us. The synergy with air, land, and sea forces and our ability to control the battle space and seize the high ground is devastating.
We're going to be able to 38 at ascension. Section A, attack forms open. Comments good.
We got no open jobs, bids until 1727, and no open bids.
In making their claim to dominate space, the Americans have staked a mysterious new battleground. Space is getting busier, and it's not just with communication satellites.
The U.S. military is developing what the Air Force in particular has called prompt global strike. That is basically, currently we have nuclear missiles that could strike anywhere on Earth within 30 minutes. What the military is talking about is a similar conventional capability that could be used to knock out, say, a Chinese anti-satellite weapons launcher in a matter of minutes. A number of concepts are being studied with this notion of prompt global strike. One is a orbiting space plane that would have the capability to be able to maneuver and also to fire weapons at a much faster pace than is currently the case. One is a orbiting space satellite that would actually have missiles on it that could be fired from space and reach a target in literally 5 to 10 minutes as opposed to the current 30 minutes.
Satellite-based missiles would park weapons in space.
Satellites can identify a target through overhead imagery, process communications about the target between military decision makers, and then guide a bomb precisely enough to destroy the target with one shot. Would it really be that big a step if a projectile itself were also launched from space? There's no practical difference, and I'd venture to say that the person on the receiving end wouldn't see the distinction either.
There's a long-standing UN treaty which bans only nuclear weapons in space. But these space-based conventional missile systems could be as devastating as nuclear warheads.
The Pentagon has said that moving the arms race into space will be the largest industrial project in the history of the planet Earth. They can't take any chances. They have to have an enemy. They have to make the people afraid. Someone's going to attack us with nuclear weapons. We've got to have missile defense in order to protect us from attack. Iraq, one of the rogue states, Iran, North Korea, and now they throw China into that equation.
For the last 3 years, the Pentagon has been trying to make China the new boogeyman, and China unwittingly played into the United States' hands with its anti-satellite test.
But it seems that not everybody in the U.S. was surprised by the Chinese anti-satellite test.
At the time, I was at a conference in Colorado Springs, and the military officers in the room actually left to watch the test in real time. So they were observing the actual Chinese anti-satellite test.
We know about every space launch. We know about every rocket launch. We have reconnaissance and surveillance satellites that can detect all these. We detected the Chinese test, for example, and in fact, we detected the 2 previous Chinese tests that failed. So we know about this. It's extremely difficult to hide space tests. They're one of the most observable weapons tests you can possibly imagine.
But blowing up satellites, your own or someone else's, has very physical consequences as well as political ones. At the Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs, the cadets understand that mastery of space has consequences. It's simple orbital mechanics.
It's hard to obtain space superiority without attacking, so I'm afraid that if we want space superiority, we're going to have to attack enemy's assets, which I don't know if you know much about orbital mechanics, but if you created debris up in space, that would just get in the way for you as well, and it kind of started a chain reaction, and pretty soon you just have a cloud of debris surrounding Earth.
There are roughly 600,000 pieces of our space garbage currently orbiting the Earth.
All of these objects are traveling at 14,000 miles an hour. So even an object the size of a pea traveling at that speed has more force than a cannonball.
Right now, the problem with space junk is so high that NASA is worried that if there is never another launch of anything into space, because every launch creates a little bit of debris, in 50 years' time, certain orbits will be so polluted that nobody can operate there, because the stuff that's already up there will start breaking up and creating more and more clutter.
1 year after the Chinese anti-satellite test, the U.S. destroyed one of its own satellites in orbit. These kinds of tests risk increasing the amount of space garbage.
The point really is creation of debris in this manner a good idea or a bad idea? And clearly it is a very bad idea, because there's no way to go up and clean that up.
The more times you go into space and you begin to practice destroying other satellites, you create so much space junk that you literally create the very likely possibility that at some point in time you will not be able to get a rocket off the planet Earth, because it'll be like a minefield around the planet, and you won't be able to escape the minefield with that rocket because it would be destroyed by all the space junk there. So we've got to begin to look at space as an environment.
Space junk grew again in early 2009 with the debris from the collision of two satellites, one American and one Russian.
We have several $100 billion of investment in the peaceful uses of outer space. I'm talking about weather satellites, positioning satellites, scientific satellites. The entire world communication network is all satellite-oriented. All this incredible investment from the United States and from the European Union and Canada and other countries like this, all this is completely at jeopardy if we start putting weapons in outer space.
This is our larger laboratory, and off to this side we have freshmen or first-year cadets working on components of our FalconSat 5 satellite that we're in the process of designing, and we'll be testing those at Kirtland Air Force Base in New Mexico.
Cadet Tuttle's father was in the Air Force, so Tuttle grew up wanting to fly. He's also picking up other skills for the age of space technology.
These are going to be the sides of the satellite. These are the only 2 panels done so far, and we need to get 6 done, so we got a lot of work to do, but hopefully we'll be done in about 2 weeks.
The rest of the world understands that the U.S. is planning to militarize space, of course. So there have been efforts to renew and extend the Outer Space Treaty. It says weapons of mass destruction can't be in space. It doesn't say other things. And there have been attempts to renew it, just to affirm it and to strengthen it. Now the U.S. blocks it every year.
We do indeed need a United Nations treaty. This is not enough. This is only step 1. Step 2 says, okay, space has been militarized. There are military networks in space. Many of them, like GPS, are useful, but we should work on international treaties to make those military space networks used for multilateral purposes. Do I think that's going to happen? I'm very doubtful, but I have to keep hoping and believing that there is a prospect for that.
But the election of Barack Obama seemed to offer the possibility of a change in the U.S. position.
I will cut tens of billions of dollars in wasteful spending. I will cut investments in unproven missile defense systems. I will not weaponize space.
Soon after he took office in January 2009, the White House stated that it would be seeking a worldwide ban on weapons that interfere with military and commercial satellites. But it's proving tough to change decades of entrenched military policy to weaponize space.
History suggests that nations do not voluntarily disarm. They disarm because they're defeated, or they make small adjustments in the way they buy and build and deploy their weapons. But no superpower says, you know, it would be better if we were weaker. I don't recall that ever happening.
The Obama administration's 2010 defense budget requested close to $1 billion that was applicable to space warfare systems. It included a new program called Offensive Counterspace. The Pentagon defined this as offensive measures to disrupt, deny, degrade, or destroy any adversary's space capabilities.
It's kind of like what happened after World War II. We had the atomic bomb. Nobody else had the atomic bomb. We thought we had a big exclusive, and with our atomic weaponry, we would be able to dominate the Earth. It didn't last very long. The Soviets had an atomic bomb. The Chinese had an atomic. Likewise in space, to think that we can move up there with weaponry and be alone to be the king on the throne of space is a tragic miscalculation.
It's probable that more countries will decide that their national space programs must also be used for national defense. Japan has lifted its ban on military use of space. Iran is pursuing an ambitious space program. So far, the European Union remains opposed to the weaponization of space. But for how much longer?
Si les Américains continuent de placer des armes, non plus des satellites militaires, mais des armes dans l'espace, il va peut-être falloir qu'on y réfléchisse et qu'on envisage au moins les moyens de se défendre ou de faire face, alors on ne dit pas à la menace américaine, mais à l'éventuelle course aux armements qui pourrait en découler.
Russia has said that if the United States fulfills its plan to position weapons in space, it will develop countermeasures to destroy any orbiting threat.
If Americans deploy space-based anti-ballistic missile defenses, then could you imagine interceptors based on space stations, military stations, would overfly territory of Russia or territory of China? That would be considered as quite unacceptable, I think, for Russians.
The potential victims are not going to say, here's my throat, please cut it. And they know that they're a potential target, and if the U.S. were to develop space weapons, they'd be completely defenseless unless they destroyed it somehow or developed a deterrent. And deterrents are known. So, for example, nuclear weapons are a deterrent. Terror is a deterrent. That's why aggressive militarism leads to an extension of proliferation and terror.
«Звездные войны», как известно, уже не фантастика, а реальность еще в середине 80-х годов. Такая политика является, конечно, катализатором гонки вооружений. Доминирование фактора силы неизбежно подпитывает тягу ряда стран к обладанию оружием массового уничтожения.
Are we looking to a future on Earth where we're surrounded by an outer layer of weapons?
If we move to weaponization of space, we can bid farewell to the planet. The chances of survival are very slight.
Every year, the U.S. Air Force Academy welcomes its best graduates to be space warriors, masters of the high ground.
Usually we're trying to bring back weapon systems after they've been deployed. Nuclear missiles, we're trying to bring them back. Here's an opportunity, one of the first times in history, actually, that we have a chance to be proactive, that we have a chance to stop a new arms race before it actually happens. That's why this moment is so crucial.
The debate over space weaponization is the most critical debate for the next century, and we are on the verge of making decisions in many nations around the world about which path to choose.